My name is Zabel Basmajan, and this is my story. I was born in a village of Çakmak, Turkey, on July 10th, 1912. My story is that of a little girl who lost her childhood growing up during those dark, evil years known as the Armenian Genocide. July 15th, 1915, 6:30 a.m. My village of Çakmak was surrounded by 2,500 Turkish authorities on horseback, as well as thousands of fanatical Turkish thugs and criminals released from prison, aided and encouraged by the Turkish authorities, together with the Turkish forces, converged on our defenseless village. The pillage, sadistic rape, torture, death, and destruction of my people seemed to come from the darkness of hell. Many of the villagers were butchered one by one in front of their own family.
Wow. Welcome to Scott Asmar, the man and everything in between. That was really heavy, Jane, and it takes me a minute to digest that. I'd like just to introduce you to podcast audience. Today we have a special guest, my wife, Jane Asmar, and we are doing a special podcast on the Armenian Genocide and the commemorating and remembering the atrocities that happened with the Armenian people. Jane, welcome.
Thank you.
And
I appreciate being here.
Tell us a little bit about this excerpt that you just read.
So this comes from my grandmother, Zabel Basmajan, and it's my mother's mother. And she's a survivor of the Armenian Genocide, as well as on my father's side, my grandmother, Elizabeth, was also a survivor. So I grew up with hearing little excerpts and stories of what happened. I knew that the genocide happened, but I didn't really understand it because, I was a child growing up and I was just having fun. But, at the dinner tables or whatnot, it was talked about in bits and pieces. And usually when we walked in, they stopped talking. But when April 24th came around, that was a day that it was a day of reverence. And every year I went with my parents. We'd go to the William Saroyan Theater. It wasn't called that back then, but it was the William Saroyan Theater. And they would commemorate April 24th. And my mother was a part of that commemoration. She would make the desserts and whatnot. And I remember there was hundreds and hundreds of people, and my grandparents were there on both sides. And it was a time for them to get together and, I guess, just support one another. Mm-hmm.
That just jogs my memory, and I think this is why I want to do this podcast and to keep to keep the genocide forefront and center for all Armenians is because my growing up, there was no commemorations. Like, I knew about April 24th. I remember seeing it on the 6:00 news, but nobody talked about it in my house because my grandparents, my grandma's side, my grandma was born here. It was my great grandmother. Her family was a victim of the 1890 massacres. So, and she was orphaned at 2 and orphanage at Izmir, Turkey, and then made it to the United States on both sides. My grandma's father, same thing, 1890 massacres, made it here in 1900. And so they were removed from it. They were making their life in the United States, in California, during the massacre. My grandpa's side, my great-grandmother, his mother, and her siblings managed to get out. All the siblings got out. They saw their parents brutally murdered, but it was never talked about. I mean, never. Of course, my great-grandmother died before I was born. And my uncle Arson, who was the youngest, would never talk about it at all. I mean, it was just, and going to an April 24th event, I didn't even know those existed until I got into college.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I joined Armenian Studies, and that was the biggest thing. And then it just kind of ignited in me that this was important. And again, going back to why this podcast is important to me and why I'm so happy that you're reading some of this excerpt is it kind of got reunited again. We were talking about this, how you tend to forget, and I hate to use those words, but a generation, that's what the enemy wants, is a generation to go by so they don't remember. Just case in point, the 1890 massacres, we don't ever talk about those. But keeping the 1915 massacre front and center, Armenian Genocide front and center, is very important. And how did you and I both get reignited? I mean, you grew up with this.
So we watched a documentary called Aurora's Sunrise, and we watched it with our children as well, because I really wanted them to understand it. And in watching this story, I was amazed at the atrocities that she went through were so similar to what both my grandmothers on either side went through, and very similar stories, and how it was they were spared. Through it all, they lost all their family, but somehow by the grace of God, they were spared. And to understand their journeys and how they both lost their childhood so young, and the atrocities they saw, we talked about, they suffered PTSD. We just didn't know it. We just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
And just by the way they did things that we would find odd and so, short. They were just dry, short, and to the point, and no real emotional, because they couldn't be. They couldn't be as children. They saw too much death, destruction, torment,
Misery.
And in this, my grandmother's account, they were ready to die. They didn't care. They were standing up against Turks. They didn't care. They were ready to die because everything was taken away from them. Everything.
So tell me a little bit more about your Auntie Nury's book and your Grandma Zabel's memoirs, or
her account. So Zabel is my mother's mother. And when this happened, my grandmother was 3 years old when the genocide began. And it was her mother, Mariam, and Mariam's sister, which would be my grandmother's aunt, Nury. Nury was a highly educated woman. She was educated through the American University. And somehow the Turkish government spared Nury, her sister, and her sister's child, which was my grandmother. And it is written in my grandmother's account. Now, it's all written in my Aunt Nury's book, and it's a few hundred pages, but it's all in Armenian. And some 30 years ago, you were part with my mother in getting that translated. And it was quite graphic.
And I have to add with that, I took it. It was translated, and then I took it to the editor to do an editing of it to get it more clear and precise. And about the third time I took it to the editor, she met me at the front door, came running down the sidewalk, and she told me, she says, I want you to take this manuscript. She says, and I can't edit this anymore. She says, it's too graphic for me even to edit. And at that point, I think we stopped.
And it's the same thing now where after we watched the documentary, I had my mom pull up the file of the book and my grandmother's account. And I'm reading it, and I can't even read the excerpts that she has written, what she saw, because it's so graphic and horrific that I think to myself, how did she survive mentally, emotionally, spiritually? I can understand now why she was always reading the Bible.
I remember your grandma.
Always reading the Bible. And I I now understand, because as I read what she went through, from 1912, she was born. They finally left, Armenia, which was Turkey at that point, to, I think in 1926, they finally left and got to Cuba. No, I take that back. They left in 23. In 1923, they finally got to Beirut and then Jerusalem, and then they went to Cuba.
So from the time she was born till 1923,
she was 11.
And they kept sparing her that whole time to the genocide. Mm-hmm.
They spared her, her mother, and her aunt. Everything was done in front of their eyes. That was part of their torture, was to see their family, their friends, all murdered horrifically.
So swinging that back around to the importance of not forgetting what these people, your family, my family, what they went through. It is just the Aurora Sunrise does a very good job in depicting, and she does it in a cartoon way. So with the flowers and the coons, you have to watch this movie, and it really will ignite you to want to keep this forefront and center for all peoples. Would you like to read another excerpt?
So my grandmother, toward the end of her life, she began to talk more about what happened to her in her childhood. And she would talk about how her and her mother were walking through this area and there were skulls and skeletons everywhere. And, for some reason, she had to run and hide in these skeletons from the Turkish thugs that met up with them. And as I read her memoir here, now I put the pieces together. So this was in the summer of 1918, and it was in Istanbul, Turkey. And she said, my mother requested permission from the Turkish authorities to visit our village of Çakmak, where I was born. Now, I was 6 years old, and my mother wanted to show me my birthplace. When we got there, my mother pointed to the location of our home that I was born in. The only part that remained were 2 walls. There were 3 spring wells that provided water to our village. And I want to stop there because my grandmother was a painter, and she painted this wall with the 3 spring wells. I never understood what it was, but now I know it came from her village. Now there were none. Then my mother took me to a place the Armenians referred to as Killer's Desert. This was the killing fields where the Turks marched men, pregnant women, children, and elderly without food or water to their final fate: torture, mutilation, and death by the tens of thousands. There I saw thousands upon thousands of bleached skeletons and bones of our people. The death march, where so many mothers begged for food and water for their children from their captors, only to be told, you're going to die anyway. Why do you need food and water? While visiting this horrific site with my mother, we were suddenly set upon by a group of fanatical Turks who grabbed me from my mother's arms and threw me to the ground. They began cursing and accusing my mother of harboring an Armenian child, as well as accusing her of not being married, and that the child did not belong to her. They commenced to beat her with clubs until she was unconscious. If it was not for the official government letter they found on my mother granting us permission to travel to our village, we would have been killed. My mother was left with many scars on her body from the beatings administered by the savage Turks. These vivid memories of what I saw and witnessed still haunts me. So much horror, so much death, so much destruction, so much grief, so many generations now lost. What words can one describe these inhumane acts of man against man? So that's where, while her mother was being beaten, she ran and hid under these skeletons so that they wouldn't they wouldn't grab her and kidnap her. And, she was 6 years old.
Jeez.
What a 6-year-old.
Speechless.
One of her, memories. And
that was her childhood.
That was her childhood
memory.
That was her childhood. One of many haunting memories like that.
And again, that is why I reignited in me and in you and in our kids, showing them the movie and
to not forget.
You can't forget. It's again, that's what the enemy wants, is for a generation to forget, a generation to pass so that it will be forgotten. And it just can't be forgotten because of what you said earlier, Jane. It can repeat itself.
It can repeat itself. And when I think about what they all went through, they had no support, really. Mm-hmm. No mental support, mental health support.
None.
And so another one of my earliest memories is, when they finally moved to Fresno, they bought a home. They finally, they had many homes, but anyways, they finally settled on Butler, where there was an enclave of Armenians there. And I remember Grandma's, house was a revolving door of all these, their neighbors coming, and they'd make our, Armenian coffee, surge, and they'd have a little snack. And while they'd be laughing and talking, somehow the conversation turned. It was all in Armenian. I didn't understand it. And they would become very passionate. And
passionate in their talk.
And it would get deep, as you could tell in the Armenian, as they spoke. And then all of a sudden, nobody would talk. It was silence.
It's silence.
And then they would just leave abruptly. And then my grandmother went to her bedroom. And I remember thinking, well, what happened? But
Did somebody say something?
Somebody say something or whatnot, offend. But I realized they were talking about what happened to them.
Because they were all survivors.
They were all survivors. They were all survivors.
And they had no place to go.
And so somehow, while they all got together, it came up. And that's how they got it out. And they would never talk about it with their children.
Yes.
Or their grandchildren. Very little. And I know my mother would say my mother never talked about it. And she says it wasn't up until her last year of life she began to tell us what she went through. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And 2 years before my grandmother died, she wrote her memoir. She wrote what happened. And because, as she stated, she didn't want the 1.5 million Armenians who perished, that their voices to ever be forgotten.
And I think that's where you and I both agree with our kids is,
they're a little removed.
They're a little removed.
Yeah.
But I think after watching that and Aurora Sunrise and bringing this to their attention, I think it really struck a chord with both of them. Like, oh my gosh, I'm here because of this.
We wouldn't be here if whatever the grace of God was to spare my grandmother on my mom's side and spare my grandmother on my dad's side, and my grandfathers, both of them were survivors of the genocide. Both of them lost their families completely and have
no records, no things,
especially on my dad's side.
Yeah.
So it's they lost everything. Mm-hmm. They lost their family. They lost their homes, their possessions. And when you think about that today, we live in it's first world problems, as we call it.
Yes.
And they really, it was survival. They didn't know minute to minute if they were going to live, but they were prepared to die at the end. They didn't care. When I read this and the excerpts from my grandmother and even Aurora, her journey, they were prepared to die. They were ready to die. Yeah. They didn't care.
They didn't care anymore.
They didn't care.
Well, that part in the movie where she managed to escape, remember, and then she went back to her village. You have to watch this movie. And went and got that gun And what did she say? She got that gun, and I thought, oh, she got the gun for protection.
No, she got the gun that if she got captured again, she would kill herself. She was prepared to die because she couldn't go through it anymore. And that is unbelievable to the horrific atrocities they went through and that they witnessed. And I can't imagine it. So then I think to myself, well, they were tough enough to get through that. I'm tough enough to get through whatever my little problems are.
Amen to that. So what is the going forward with these books? Are you going to look to publish, or is it just for family? Or
a lot of it right now is we would like to get the book completely translated. And right now it's more for our family to understand what, our ancestors went through. And
just another piece of the genocide.
Well, it fills the dots in for me, especially growing up. I can understand now my grandma's personality, why she would do things. And, I didn't know my grandma Zabel's mother. She had died before I was born, but I did know Nury.
Okay.
So she definitely suffered a lot, but she was a strong woman, a very strong woman. And I could see why my grandma Zabel, she took care of her, and lived with her. And I remember when she died, my grandmother was very, very broken up about that. But she was happy, she was at peace, and she was with Jesus. They were very, very devout Christians. And so, and part of the story with my grandmother is they left for Cuba, hoping that in a couple of years they could come to the United States.
Yeah,
but
they were in Cuba a while.
20 years.
Until they made it to
and until they were finally granted a visa, and they had built a life. So there, my grandmother met her husband, John, my grandfather. They had their 4 kids in Cuba. And then, the dictator, the Cuban dictator, Juan Batista, didn't allow them to take anything.
So they had to leave everything again.
It was the clothes on their back and them, getting to Miami. And then the war had just ended. It was October 2nd, 1946. And the war had ended, and they were with the soldiers, and they were on the trains and making their way to Fresno.
And here we are.
And so they were not afraid to start all over. They were just happy to come to a country where they wouldn't be persecuted, tortured for their ethnic race and for their religious beliefs, being a Christian. And they were so thankful, and they were fine to start all over again. And they did. And they were happy. They really were. Yeah. My grandfather always sang, and my grandmother was always cooking, and she was happy.
And painting. She
was an artist. And she finally, I'd say her last years of her life were her best, because, my mom and dad got her a new home near where her daughters were. And every day they visited, and I would say that added 10 years to my grandmother's life. So she died at 95, age of 95. And I miss her laugh. I just remember her laughing a lot. And finally, she lived a peaceful life, a happy life that she never got in her childhood. And that's what you want for your children.
That's what you want.
You want your children to have a
happy, peaceful
laughter.
Yeah.
And she didn't have that. But at the end, she did.
Dear, I've done it. Thank you for sharing all of this with us. And I think, we've just front and center every April 24th and beyond. We go to the monument every year.
And the monument at Fresno State is something my family very much supported, because of the fact that they, both families, were survivors. So it was very important to our family that monument get built.
And it is. And that's who we have pulled their memories. Again, I want to thank you for sharing this deep personal accounts with your grandmother, and
I'm honored to do so.
and
Thank
maybe
you for having me.
of course. And I think we could revisit this subject again and maybe talk about, or you could read some more excerpts.
Hopefully, maybe from my Aunt Nury's book.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.